What if your daughter disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night, with every door and window locked from the inside? What if the only trace she left behind was a single drop of blood that didn't belong to her, and a stuffed animal placed in a position she would never have left it? In the spring of 2002, that's exactly what happened in a quiet Dallas suburb. A 7-year-old girl named Melissa Rose Hartley vanished without a sound, without a struggle, without a single witness. Her disappearance would become one of Texas's most baffling cold cases, a mystery so perplexing that seasoned investigators would lie awake at night trying to solve it. For 23 years, her mother kept her bedroom exactly as she left it. For 23 years, detectives chased hundreds of leads that went nowhere. For 23 years, the person responsible walked free, hiding in plain sight, living an ordinary life while a family's nightmare continued. But in 2025, a single piece of evidence, overlooked for more than 2 decades, would finally crack this cold case wide open. The breakthrough would lead to an arrest that shocked the entire Dallas community, revealing a truth so disturbing that even veteran homicide detectives struggled to process it. This is the story of the Melissa Hartley case. This is the story of a cold case solved. And this is a reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, never forgets. Let me introduce you to Melissa Rose Hartley. She was 7 years old in the spring of 2002. Born on October 12, 1994, Melissa was a second grader at Oakwood Elementary School in the Pleasant Grove neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. Her teachers described her as bright, curious, and unusually thoughtful for her age. She loved reading chapter books that were meant for kids twice her age, and she had a particular fascination with astronomy and space exploration. Melissa had striking features that people remembered: long, dark brown hair that her mother, Jennifer Hartley, would braid every morning before school, and these incredibly expressive hazel eyes that seemed to change color depending on what she was wearing. She had a small birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped almost like a tiny star, which her father, David Hartley, used to joke was proof she was meant to explore the cosmos. Her favorite possession was a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers. She'd had it since she was a baby, and despite its worn fur and missing button eye, she refused to sleep without it. Every night, without fail, she would position Mr. Whiskers on the left side of her pillow, facing the window. It was a ritual, a comfort, a constant in her young life. Melissa was an only child. Her parents, Jennifer and David, had tried for years to have a baby before she was born, which made her arrival feel like a miracle to them. Jennifer worked as a nurse at Baylor University Medical Center. David was a high school chemistry teacher at Woodrow Wilson High School. They were a typical middle-class family in a typical American suburb, living in a modest 3-bedroom house on Ferndale Avenue. The Hartleys' home was in a safe, family-oriented neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes in the streets. Neighbors knew each other by name. Block parties happened every summer. It was the kind of place where parents didn't worry too much, where children could play outside until the streetlights came on, where you could leave your front door unlocked without a second thought. Melissa had dreams. Big dreams for such a small person. She told anyone who would listen that she wanted to be an astronaut when she grew up. She wanted to walk on Mars. She wanted to discover new planets. She had a telescope in her room, a birthday gift from her grandparents, and on clear nights, she would spend hours staring at the stars, mapping constellations, making wishes on shooting stars. But Melissa had fears too. Like many children her age, she was afraid of the dark. She insisted on having a nightlight, a small one shaped like a crescent moon that plugged into the wall near her bed. She was also afraid of thunderstorms, and would sometimes climb into her parents' bed during particularly loud nights, seeking comfort in their presence. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Melissa had been acting differently. Her mother noticed she seemed distracted, sometimes staring off into space during dinner. She'd started having nightmares, waking up crying, but she couldn't or wouldn't explain what the dreams were about. Jennifer chalked it up to growing pains, maybe stress from school, maybe just a phase. On the evening of April 13, 2002, Melissa seemed normal. She came home from school, did her homework at the kitchen table while her mother prepared dinner, played in the backyard for about 30 minutes before the sun set, then came inside for her bath. After dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, her favorite. She watched one episode of a cartoon on television, brushed her teeth, kissed both her parents goodnight, and went to bed at 8:30 p.m., just like always. It was the last time Jennifer and David Hartley would see their daughter alive. The morning of April 14, 2002, started like any other Sunday. Jennifer Hartley woke up around 7 a.m., made coffee, and started preparing pancakes for breakfast. David was in the shower. The house was quiet, peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of a weekend morning. At 7:30, Jennifer walked down the hallway to wake Melissa for breakfast. She knocked gently on the door, the way she always did. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. Assuming Melissa was still sleeping deeply, Jennifer opened the door and stepped inside. The bed was empty. The covers were pulled back, as if Melissa had gotten up normally. Mr. Whiskers, the stuffed rabbit, was still there on the pillow, but something was wrong. It was facing the wrong direction. Instead of facing the window like Melissa always positioned it, Mr. Whiskers was facing the door, as if watching, as if waiting. Jennifer's first thought was that Melissa had gotten up to use the bathroom. She checked. Empty. She called out Melissa's name, her voice echoing through the house. Nothing. She checked the other bedrooms. Nothing. She ran downstairs, checking every room, calling Melissa's name louder now, panic rising in her throat. The kitchen, the living room, the basement, the garage. Nothing. 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 David heard the commotion and rushed out of the bathroom, still in his robe. "She's not here," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "Melissa's not here. I can't find her." Together, they tore through the house again, checking closets, looking under beds, searching places too small for a child to hide but searching them anyway because they didn't know what else to do. That's when they noticed something that made their blood run cold. Every door in the house was locked. Every window was closed and latched from the inside. The security system, which they'd armed before bed, showed no record of being disarmed during the night. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged locks, no disturbed screens. It was as if Melissa had simply vanished into thin air, like a ghost passing through walls, leaving behind only questions and a terrible, suffocating silence. At 7:52 a.m., David Hartley called 911. The recording of that call would later become evidence in the case, and listening to it, you can hear the raw terror in his voice, the disbelief, the desperation. "My daughter is missing," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "She was in her bed last night, and now she's gone. Every door is locked. I don't understand. I don't understand how this is possible." Dallas police arrived within 6 minutes. Officers Marcus Chun and Patricia Rodriguez were the first on scene. They immediately recognized this wasn't a typical runaway situation. 7-year-olds don't unlock security systems. 7-year-olds don't lock doors behind them. 7-year-olds don't disappear from locked houses without leaving a trace. By 8:30 a.m., the house was swarming with law enforcement. Detectives from the Dallas Police Department's Child Exploitation and Missing Persons Unit arrived. Crime scene investigators began documenting everything. Search and rescue teams started canvassing the neighborhood. The FBI's Crimes Against Children Division was notified, putting the case on their radar within the first hour. And then, at 9:15 a.m., a crime scene investigator named Thomas Brennan made a discovery in Melissa's bedroom that would haunt this case for the next 23 years. On the windowsill, partially hidden behind the curtain, was a single drop of blood. Just one, perfectly round, already dried. They tested it immediately using rapid field analysis. The results sent shockwaves through the investigation. The blood wasn't Melissa's. It wasn't Jennifer's. It wasn't David's. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had been in that room. Someone who had left their mark. But who? And how did they get in? And most importantly, where was Melissa? Detective Sarah Morales took lead on the case within the first 24 hours. A 15-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department, Morales had worked dozens of missing children cases, but she would later say that the Melissa Hartley disappearance was unlike anything she'd ever encountered. The locked room aspect of it, The complete absence of evidence, the single drop of foreign blood, it defied every logical explanation. The initial investigation was massive and methodical. Every inch of the Hartley home was photographed, documented, analyzed. They dusted for fingerprints and found only those belonging to family members and a handful of expected visitors. They used luminol to search for blood evidence and found nothing except that single drop on the windowsill. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the property and the surrounding area. The dogs found nothing. The neighborhood canvassing began immediately. Detectives knocked on every door within a 6-block radius. Did anyone see anything unusual on the night of April 13th or the early morning of April 14th? Did anyone hear anything? A car engine? A child crying? Footsteps? Voices? Anything at all? One neighbor, a retired postal worker named Margaret Foster who lived 3 houses down, reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked on the street around midnight. She described it as a dark-colored sedan, possibly a Honda or Toyota, with what might have been temporary paper license plates in the back window. She couldn't be certain of the make or model, and she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Visitors were common in the neighborhood. That detail about the temporary plates would turn out to be important, though at the time, investigators didn't know just how important. Another neighbor, a college student named Brian Wallace who was home on spring break, told police he'd seen a man walking down Ferndale Avenue around 1:30 a.m. He'd been up late studying and happened to look out his window. The man was average height, wearing what looked like dark clothing, walking at a normal pace, nothing obviously suspicious. Wallace couldn't make out facial features in the darkness. The man was there, and then he wasn't, disappearing between streetlights like a shadow. Detectives created a timeline. Melissa went to bed at 8:30 p.m. Jennifer and David armed the security system at 10:15 p.m. and went to bed by 10:45 p.m. Margaret Foster saw the unfamiliar vehicle at midnight. Brian Wallace saw the man walking at 1:30 a.m. Jennifer discovered Melissa missing at 7:30 a.m. That gave investigators a window of approximately 9 hours, but realistically, they believed the abduction happened between midnight and 3 a.m., during the deepest part of the night when the neighborhood was asleep. But how? That was the question that kept Detective Morales awake for months. How does someone enter a house with an armed security system, unlock a child's bedroom, take the child, lock everything back up, and leave without triggering any alarms? It seemed impossible, and yet it had happened. The blood sample became the investigation's most critical piece of evidence. DNA analysis in 2002 was advancing rapidly, but it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it would become in later years. The lab was able to extract a partial male DNA profile from the sample, indicating the blood belonged to a man of European ancestry, likely between the ages of 25 and 55. They entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, hoping for a match. There was none. Early leads multiplied quickly. Police received hundreds of tips in the first week alone. Everyone was followed up on, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Someone reported seeing a young girl matching Melissa's description at a gas station in Oklahoma. Detectives drove there immediately. It wasn't her. Another caller swore they saw Melissa at a shopping mall in Houston. That lead went nowhere too. A psychic from Louisiana contacted the department, claiming she could see Melissa's location through visions. Despite skepticism, Morales followed up on it. Nothing came of it. The investigation widened. Detectives looked at registered sex offenders in the area. There were 12 within a 5-mile radius of the Hartley home. Each one was interviewed, their alibis checked, their homes searched with warrants when probable cause existed. None of them matched the DNA profile. None of them had any connection to Melissa or her family. They investigated family members next because statistically, most child abductions involve someone known to the victim. David Hartley's alibi was airtight. He was home, sleeping next to his wife all night. Jennifer's was the same. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends. Everyone was interviewed, cleared, documented. Detectives then focused on people who might have had access to the house. A plumber had done work there 2 weeks before Melissa's disappearance. His name was Thomas Kendrick, and he became a person of interest. Police brought him in for questioning. He cooperated fully, provided a DNA sample voluntarily. It didn't match. He had an alibi for the night in question. He was at a family reunion in San Antonio with dozens of witnesses. Another person of interest emerged, a man named Victor Castellano, who had worked briefly as a security system installer for the company that maintained the Hartleys' home security. Police learned that Castellano had been fired from the company 3 months before Melissa's disappearance for showing up to work intoxicated. More concerning, he had a previous arrest for peeping Tom behavior 10 years earlier, though he'd never been convicted. Detective Morales brought Castellano in for an interview. He was nervous, evasive, his story didn't quite add up. He claimed he was home alone the night Melissa disappeared, watching television, no alibi. When asked for a DNA sample, he initially refused, which raised red flags. Detectives obtained a warrant, collected his DNA. The lab results came back 3 weeks later. Not a match. With each dead end, the investigation lost momentum. The media attention that had been so intense in the first weeks began to fade. The tip line, which had been ringing constantly, started to go quiet. The FBI reduced their presence, though they kept the case active in their system. After 6 months, the Dallas Police Department had exhausted every lead, interviewed over 300 people, collected dozens of DNA samples, and they were no closer to finding Melissa Hartley than they'd been on day one. The case was officially designated as a cold case in early 2003, though Detective Morales never stopped working it. She kept the file on her desk, reviewed it regularly, chased down new leads whenever they emerged. She called Jennifer and David Hartley every month with updates, even when there were no updates to give, just to let them know they hadn't been forgotten. But as months turned into years, and years turned into decades, the truth remained buried. The person responsible remained free, and Melissa Hartley remained missing. The years after Melissa's disappearance were brutal for the Hartley family. Jennifer and David's marriage, once strong and loving, began to crumble under the weight of grief and guilt. They blamed themselves. They blamed each other irrationally but inevitably. David withdrew into himself, spending long hours at work, avoiding the house that held too many painful memories. Jennifer became obsessed with finding Melissa, dedicating every waking moment to the search. She created a missing persons website, updating it religiously with new photos, new information, appeals to the public. She organized search parties every few months, gathering volunteers to comb through wooded areas, abandoned buildings, anywhere Melissa might be. She attended every cold case conference she could find, networking with other families, learning from their experiences, desperately hoping for that one piece of information that would bring her daughter home. Melissa's bedroom remained untouched. Jennifer couldn't bring herself to change anything. The telescope still stood by the window. The bookshelves still held her favorite stories. Mr. Whiskers still sat on the pillow, that stuffed rabbit with the missing button eye, positioned exactly where police had documented it on the morning of the disappearance. It was like a shrine, frozen in time, a testament to a life interrupted. Detective Sarah Morales retired from the Dallas Police Department in 2010, but she took copies of the Melissa Hartley case file with her. Even in retirement, she couldn't let it go. She would sit in her home office, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking at crime scene photos, rereading forensic reports, convinced she was missing something obvious. Over the years, there were occasional developments that briefly reignited hope. In 2007, human remains were discovered in a rural area outside Fort Worth. DNA testing confirmed they weren't Melissa's. In 2011, a woman came forward claiming she had been kidnapped as a child in 2002 and might be Melissa Hartley. DNA testing proved she wasn't. In 2015, a death row inmate in Oklahoma confessed to killing multiple children, including one in Dallas. Investigators interviewed him extensively. His confession was false, seeking attention and possibly hoping to delay his execution. These false alarms were torture for the Hartley family. Each time, hope would surge only to be crushed when the lead evaporated. Jennifer described it as dying over and over again, each disappointment reopening the wound that never truly healed. Meanwhile, cold case technology was advancing rapidly. DNA analysis techniques that were cutting-edge in 2002 became routine by 2010. Touch DNA, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, YSTR analysis. These tools were revolutionizing how law enforcement approached old cases. But the Melissa Hartley case file sat in storage, that blood sample preserved but not reanalyzed with the new techniques, waiting for someone to take another look. In 2018, something significant happened in the world of cold case investigations. Law enforcement agencies began using genetic genealogy databases to identify suspects, the same databases that private citizens use to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. The Golden State Killer case in California was the high-profile breakthrough that proved the method's effectiveness. Suddenly, solved cases that had been cold for decades were being closed using this new investigative tool. The Dallas Police Department took notice. They created a specialized cold case unit in 2019, staffed by detectives trained in these new techniques and supported by federal grants to fund DNA reanalysis and genealogy research. The unit began systematically reviewing the department's oldest unsolved cases, prioritizing those with preserved biological evidence. In June 2024, a young detective named Marcus Liu was assigned to review a batch of cold cases from the early 2000s. He was 32 years old, born in 1992, which meant he was 10 years old when Melissa Hartley disappeared. He vaguely remembered seeing her picture on the news as a child, that haunting school photo that had been broadcast thousands of times, the image of a girl with braided hair and hazel eyes who had simply vanished. Liu pulled the Hartley case file from the archives. It was thick, hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, forensic analyses, tip-line summaries. He spent 3 full days reading every single page, absorbing the details, understanding why this case had frustrated so many investigators before him. The locked room mystery, the absence of evidence, the single drop of blood, that blood sample, that partial DNA profile from 2002. Liu requested the evidence from storage and sent it to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab with a specific instruction: reanalyze using the latest DNA extraction techniques and, if possible, develop a complete profile suitable for genetic genealogy comparison. It was a routine request, just another cold case getting another look with better technology. Liu had no idea he was about to crack one of Dallas's most infamous unsolved cases. He had no idea he was about to change everything. But sometimes that's how justice works. Not with dramatic breakthroughs or brilliant deductions, but with patient, methodical work and the willingness to look one more time at evidence everyone else had given up on. On October 3, 2024, Detective Marcus Liu's phone rang. It was the crime lab. The DNA reanalysis was complete, and they had news. Big news. Using advanced DNA extraction techniques that didn't exist in 2002, the lab had successfully developed a complete genetic profile from that blood sample. Where the original analysis had yielded only partial data, the new process had recovered a full, high-quality DNA profile suitable for comparison in multiple databases. Liu immediately entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's criminal DNA database. No match. But he expected that, if the suspect had been in CODIS, the case would have been solved years ago. The real breakthrough would come from genetic genealogy. With authorization from the district attorney's office, Liu uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database where users voluntarily share their DNA data to find relatives. The database contained genetic information from millions of people who had used commercial ancestry testing services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA and then uploaded their results to GEDmatch to find distant cousins and trace their family trees. The system took hours to process the data, comparing the unknown male's DNA profile against millions of others, looking for overlapping genetic markers that would indicate family relationships. Liu waited, barely able to concentrate on anything else. By the end of the day, the results were in. The profile had multiple matches, dozens of third cousins, fourth cousins, distant relatives who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown male. This was exactly what Liu needed. Each match was a thread, and by pulling on those threads carefully, a genetic genealogist could theoretically trace backward through family trees to identify the source. Liu contacted C.C. Moore, a renowned genetic genealogist who had helped law enforcement solve numerous cold cases. Moore agreed to take on the Hartley case. Over the next 6 weeks, She worked methodically through the DNA matches, building family trees, tracing lineages, identifying common ancestors. The process was painstaking. Each DNA match represented a different branch of a family tree that had to be researched, documented, and traced back through generations. Moore worked with birth records, marriage certificates, death records, census data, immigration documents, hundreds of pieces of historical information that together formed a picture of a family's genealogy. By mid-November 2024, Moore had identified a common ancestor, a couple named Johann and Greta Hoffman who had emigrated from Germany to the United States in 1923, settling in Pennsylvania. Their descendants had spread across the country over the subsequent decades, creating multiple family branches. The unknown male whose blood was found in Melissa Hartley's bedroom was descended from this couple, probably a great-great-grandson. Moore narrowed the family tree down to 12 possible individuals. Men who were the right age in 2002, who had the right genetic ancestry, who descended from the Hoffman family. She provided this list to Detective Liu on November 22, 2024. Liu began the process of elimination. Some of the men on the list had died before 2002, so they were ruled out immediately. Others had been living in different states in 2002 with documented proof, employment records, lease agreements, bank statements. Those were eliminated too. By December 1, 2024, Liu had narrowed the list down to 3 possibilities. 3 men who were the right age, the right ancestry, and who couldn't be definitively ruled out based on location in 2002. One of them was the person responsible for Melissa Hartley's disappearance. Liu just had to figure out which one. The first was a man named Robert Henderson, 56 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona. Liu traveled to Arizona, conducted surveillance, eventually collected a discarded coffee cup from a trash can outside Henderson's workplace. The DNA from the cup was sent to the lab for comparison. Not a match. The second was a man named Michael Kruger, 52 years old, living in Austin, Texas. Liu repeated the process: surveillance, evidence collection, lab comparison. Again, not a match. That left the third man. His name was Daniel James Hoffman, 54 years old. And here's where the case took a turn that no one expected. Daniel Hoffman lived in Dallas. He had lived in Dallas in 2002. In fact, in April 2002, he had lived less than 2 miles from the Hartley family home. Detective Liu pulled every record he could find on Daniel Hoffman, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. In March 2002, 1 month before Melissa Hartley disappeared, Daniel Hoffman had purchased a dark blue Honda Accord. The temporary paper license plate had been valid through April 30, 2002. Margaret Foster, the neighbor who saw an unfamiliar vehicle with temporary plates on the night of Melissa's disappearance, had been right. She had seen the abductor's car. But there was more. Daniel Hoffman had worked in 2002 for a company called SecureTech Solutions. And what did SecureTech Solutions do? They installed and serviced home security systems. The same type of system that was in the Hartley home. The same system that showed no sign of being disarmed on the night of the disappearance. Hoffman had the knowledge to bypass the security system. He had the vehicle that matched witness descriptions. His DNA was in Melissa's bedroom. The pieces were falling into place. Detective Liu dug deeper into Hoffman's background. And here's what made this case go from cold to burning hot. Daniel Hoffman had been interviewed during the original 2002 investigation. He'd been on the list of SecureTech employees who had access to the Hartley home security system information. But back then, he'd provided an alibi. He claimed he was visiting his sister in Oklahoma on the night of April 13th, and without any physical evidence tying him to the scene, and without DNA to compare, he'd been cleared and removed from the suspect list. His alibi had been a lie, and for 23 years he'd gotten away with it. Now, Detective Liu just had to prove it. He needed a confirmed DNA match directly from Hoffman, not from a discarded item but something that would hold up in court beyond any reasonable doubt. And he needed to find out what happened to Melissa Hartley. On December 10, 2024, Liu presented his findings to the district attorney's office. They agreed they had enough for a warrant. The next step would be to bring Daniel Hoffman in for questioning and, if possible, get him to talk. What happened next would shock everyone involved in the case. Detective Marcus Liu assembled a team. This wasn't going to be a simple interview. Daniel Hoffman had evaded justice for 23 years. He was smart, careful, and he'd lied convincingly before. Liu needed to approach this strategically. The team included Liu, two other detectives from the cold case unit veterans named Angela Martinez and James Crawford, and a forensic psychologist named Dr. Rebecca Chun who specialized in interviewing suspects in child abduction cases. They spent 2 full days preparing, reviewing every detail of the case, anticipating how Hoffman might respond, planning their approach. On December 13, 2024, at 6:30 a.m., Liu and his team executed a search warrant at Daniel Hoffman's residence, a modest rental house in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. Hoffman answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly surprised by the early morning visit. He was balding, with graying hair, average build, completely unremarkable in appearance. The kind of man who blends into a crowd, who you wouldn't remember 5 minutes after passing him on the street. "Daniel Hoffman?" Liu said, showing his badge. "I'm Detective Liu with Dallas PD. We have a warrant to search your residence, and we need you to come with us to answer some questions." Hoffman's reaction was telling. His face went pale. His hands started to shake slightly, but he didn't ask why. Most innocent people, when confronted by police at their door with a search warrant, immediately ask what's going on, what they're looking for, what this is about. Hoffman didn't. He just nodded slowly and said, "Let me get my shoes." The search of Hoffman's house took 4 hours. Crime scene investigators documented everything, collected items for potential evidence, took photographs of every room. What they found was disturbing, though not in the way you might expect. Hoffman's house was obsessively organized. Everything had a place. Books arranged by height on shelves. Canned goods in the pantry lined up with labels facing forward. Clothes in the closet organized by color and type. It was the home of someone who needed control, who couldn't tolerate disorder or chaos. But there was something else. In Hoffman's bedroom closet, hidden in a shoebox on the top shelf, investigators found a collection of newspaper clippings. All of them were about Melissa Hartley's disappearance. Articles from 2002, anniversary pieces from 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. He'd been following the case for 23 years, keeping a careful record of the investigation, tracking what police knew and didn't know. It was the behavior of someone who couldn't let go of what he'd done, who needed to relive it, who, on some level, wanted to be caught. Meanwhile, at Dallas Police Headquarters, Hoffman sat in an interview room. It was a standard setup: gray walls, a metal table, 3 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner recording everything. Liu let him sit alone for 30 minutes, a deliberate tactic to increase anxiety and discomfort. When Liu and Detective Martinez finally entered the room, they played it casual at first. "Thanks for coming in, Mr. Hoffman," Liu said, settling into the chair across from him. "We're reviewing some old cases, and your name came up in connection with one from 2002. Do you remember being interviewed by police back then about a missing girl named Melissa Hartley?" Hoffman nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I remember. I worked for the security company. They interviewed everyone." "Right," Liu said. "And if I recall from the report, you told investigators you were in Oklahoma that weekend, visiting your sister. Is that correct?" "Yes," Hoffman said, but his voice wavered slightly. "Here's the thing, Mr. Hoffman," Detective Martinez said, leaning forward. "We've been going back through the case with fresh eyes, using some new technology that wasn't available in 2002. And we've made some discoveries. For example, we were able to develop a complete DNA profile from evidence found at the scene. A drop of blood on the windowsill in Melissa's bedroom." Hoffman's face went white. His hands, resting on the table, started to tremble visibly. "We compared that DNA to genealogical databases," Liu continued. "And you know what we found? We found your family tree. Your great-great-grandparents, your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your parents. And eventually, we found you. We know you were there, Daniel. Your blood is in that bedroom. We just need to understand how it got there." Hoffman sat motionless for nearly a minute. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I cut my hand on the window latch," he said. "I didn't even realize I was bleeding until I was back in the car." The room seemed to freeze. Lou and Martinez exchanged a quick glance. This was it. The admission they needed. "Okay," Lou said carefully. "Thank you for being honest about that. Can you walk us through what happened that night? Start from the beginning." And then, over the next 2 hours, Daniel Hoffman confessed to everything. What Daniel Hoffman described in that interrogation room was every parent's worst nightmare. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, as if recounting something that had happened to someone else, as if by distancing himself from the words, he could distance himself from the horror of what he'd done. Hoffman explained that in early 2002, he'd been struggling with what he called dark thoughts. He had developed an obsession with a specific type of child, young girls with dark hair around 7 or 8 years old. He claimed he didn't understand where these thoughts came from, that he tried to suppress them, but they consumed him. Through his work at Secure Tech Solutions, Hoffman had access to customer information, including addresses and security system details. He admitted that he would sometimes drive through neighborhoods where the company had clients, looking at houses, fantasizing, fighting with himself over what he wanted to do versus what he knew was wrong. In March 2002, Secure Tech received a service call from the Hartley residence. The security system was giving false alarms, needing adjustment. Hoffman volunteered to take the call. When he arrived at the house, Jennifer Hartley let him in, showed him to the control panel, and left him alone to work while she went back to her nursing shift. David was at school teaching. Melissa was at school too. Hoffman fixed the alarm system, but while he was there, he looked around. He saw family photos on the wall. He saw Melissa's school picture on the refrigerator, and something dark clicked in his mind. He began planning. Over the next 3 weeks, Hoffman drove past the Hartley home multiple times, learning the family's routine. He knew when they left for work and school. He knew when they came home. He knew when the lights went out at night. He was patient, methodical, careful. On the night of April 13, 2002, Hoffman made his move. He waited until well after midnight, until the neighborhood was completely dark and silent. He parked his Honda Accord 3 blocks away and walked to the Hartley home, wearing dark clothing, gloves, and a baseball cap pulled low. He went to the back of the house where he knew there was a window to Melissa's bedroom. Using the master security code he'd memorized from his service visit, a code that would bypass the system without triggering any alarm or leaving any electronic record, he unlocked the window from the outside. It was an old-style system with a vulnerability that Secure Tech would later fix, but in 2002 it was a flaw that Hoffman knew how to exploit. The window opened silently. Hoffman climbed through, careful and quiet, but as he lifted himself over the sill, the metal latch scraped against his palm, cutting into the skin. He felt the sharp pain but didn't stop. He was inside now, in the dark bedroom, looking down at a sleeping 7-year-old girl. He stood there for a moment, he said, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would wake the child. But Melissa slept on, her stuffed rabbit beside her on the pillow, her nightlight casting a soft glow. Hoffman picked Melissa up carefully. She stirred slightly but didn't fully wake. Children often don't when lifted from deep sleep. He carried her to the window, climbed back out with her in his arms, closed and locked the window behind him using the security bypass code again. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. He carried Melissa to his car, placed her in the back seat, and drove away. By the time she woke up and realized what was happening, they were miles from her home, and it was too late. "Where did you take her?" Detective Lou asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Hoffman looked down at his hands. "I had a storage unit," he said quietly, "out past Mesquite, off Highway 80. It was isolated. No one around." "And what happened there, Daniel?" Detective Martinez asked. "I kept her there for 2 days," Hoffman said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I wanted. But on the 2nd day, she got sick. I think she was having some kind of allergic reaction to something in the storage unit. It was dusty, moldy. She started having trouble breathing. I panicked. I didn't call for help. I should have, but I didn't. I was terrified of being caught. So I just waited, and she got worse. And then, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Where is she now, Daniel? Lou asked. Where is Melissa? Lake Ray Hubbard, Hoffman said. There's a spot on the northeast shore, past the marina, where the water's deep. I weighted her down and that's where she is. That's where she's been all these years. The interrogation room went completely silent. Detective Lou felt like he couldn't breathe. After 23 years, they finally knew. They finally had answers. But the answers were so much worse than anyone had imagined. Lou stepped out of the room, called the district attorney, and arranged for formal charges to be filed. Then he made the hardest phone call of his career. He called Jennifer Hartley and told her they'd found the person responsible for Melissa's disappearance. And he told her that Melissa was gone. 23 years of hope, shattered in a single phone call. But also 23 years of not knowing finally resolved. It was the closure the family had desperately needed, even though the truth was unbearable. On December 13, 2024, at 4:30 p.m., Daniel James Hoffman was formally arrested and charged with capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, and evidence tampering. He was taken from the interrogation room to a holding cell, processed through the jail system, and booked into the Dallas County Jail. The Dallas Police Department held a press conference at 6 p.m. that same evening. It was packed with reporters from local and national media outlets. The Melissa Hartley case had been one of those mysteries that captured public attention and never quite let go. The news that it had been solved after 23 years was massive. Dallas Police Chief Amanda Richardson stood at the podium, flanked by Detective Marcus Liu, District Attorney Warren Hayes, and FBI Special Agent Thomas Brennan, who had been involved in the original 2002 investigation. Camera flashes lit up the room. Reporters held recording devices toward the podium, ready to capture every word. Today, I'm here to announce a significant development in the disappearance of Melissa Rose Hartley, Chief Richardson began. After 23 years, through advances in DNA technology and the dedicated work of our cold case unit, we have arrested and charged 54-year-old Daniel James Hoffman with capital murder in connection with Melissa's death. The room erupted with questions. Reporters shouted over each other, all wanting details, all wanting to understand how this cold case had finally been solved. Chief Richardson raised her hand for silence. I'll provide what details I can at this time. In 2002, a blood sample was recovered from Melissa's bedroom. At the time, DNA technology could only produce a partial profile, which was entered into databases but yielded no matches. In 2024, Detective Marcus Liu reopened the case and sent the evidence for reanalysis using modern forensic techniques. This new analysis produced a complete DNA profile, which was then compared using genetic genealogy methods, similar to techniques used in other high-profile cold cases around the country. Through painstaking genealogical research, we identified Daniel Hoffman as a suspect. Following an interview this morning, Mr. Hoffman confessed to kidnapping Melissa from her home on April 14, 2002, and subsequently causing her death. This is a bittersweet moment. We've answered the questions that have haunted the Hartley family and this community for over 2 decades. But those answers come with the devastating confirmation that Melissa did not survive. Our hearts go out to Jennifer and David Hartley and all those who loved Melissa. The news spread through Dallas like wildfire. Social media exploded with reactions. People who remembered the original case from 2002 expressed shock and sadness. Younger people who'd never heard of Melissa Hartley began researching the case, reading old news articles, looking at her photograph. In the Pleasant Grove neighborhood where the Hartleys had lived, residents organized an impromptu memorial. People brought flowers, candles, teddy bears, and left them at the corner of Ferndale Avenue. A poster-sized school photo of Melissa, the same image that had been broadcast for 23 years, was placed in the center of the memorial. By evening, the pile of flowers was 6 feet wide. Margaret Foster, the neighbor who had seen the unfamiliar car in 2002, gave an interview to a local news station. "I've thought about that night 1,000 times," she said, her voice shaking. I wish I'd gotten the license plate number. I wish I'd called the police right then. Maybe things would have been different. Police were quick to remind the community that this wasn't about blame. Ms. Foster provided valuable information in 2002, and that information ultimately contributed to solving this case. Detective Liu told reporters, "There's nothing she could have done differently. This is on one person, and one person only, Daniel Hoffman." Jennifer Hartley released a statement through her attorney. She was too overwhelmed to speak publicly, but her words were read at the press conference. "For 23 years, I've lived in agony, not knowing what happened to my daughter. Today I have answers, though they are not the answers I prayed for. Melissa is gone, and nothing will bring her back. But knowing that the person responsible will face justice brings a measure of peace. I want to thank Detective Liu and everyone who never gave up on Melissa's case. You gave us closure when we'd almost given up hope." The statement continued. Melissa was a bright, curious, loving child who dreamed of exploring the stars. Her life was stolen from her, and from all of us who loved her. I will spend the rest of my life honoring her memory and advocating for other missing children and their families. No one should have to endure what we've endured. The arrest shocked the Dallas community for multiple reasons. First, because Daniel Hoffman had been living among them for decades, an ordinary man with an extraordinary secret. Second, because the case seemed so impossible in 2002, so unsolvable, and yet advances in technology had finally cracked it. And third, because it proved something people desperately needed to believe: that cold cases can be solved, that justice can prevail, that truth will eventually come to light no matter how long it takes. But the arrest was just the beginning. Now came the prosecution, the trial, the quest to hold Daniel Hoffman accountable for what he'd done. And that process would reveal even more disturbing details about the man who had hidden in plain sight for 23 years. Daniel Hoffman's trial began on March 3, 2025, in the 292nd District Court of Dallas County. Judge Patricia Monroe presided. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Walsh, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for handling complex cases with precision and tenacity. Hoffman's defense attorney was a public defender named Richard Carver, who faced the near-impossible task of defending a client who had already confessed. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, along with members of the public who had followed the case for years. Jennifer Hartley sat in the front row, her face drawn and exhausted, flanked by victim advocates from the district attorney's office. David Hartley, who had divorced Jennifer in 2009 under the strain of their daughter's disappearance, sat several rows back, unable to be near his ex-wife but needing to be present nonetheless. Daniel Hoffman sat at the defense table in a gray suit, looking smaller somehow than he had during the interrogation, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the gaze of everyone in the room. In her opening statement, ADA Walsh laid out the case with clinical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about a monster who hid behind an ordinary face. Daniel Hoffman was a security technician, a man who people trusted to protect their homes and families. But he used that trust, that access, to commit an unspeakable act. On the night of April 13, 2002, he exploited his knowledge of security systems to break into the Hartley home, kidnap 7-year-old Melissa, and ultimately cause her death. For 23 years, Melissa's family lived in agony, not knowing what happened to her, not knowing if she was alive or dead, suffering every single day with questions that had no answers. For 23 years, Daniel Hoffman walked free, went about his life, knowing exactly what he'd done and where Melissa was. He could have ended their suffering at any time. He chose not to. That tells you everything you need to know about who this man is. Richard Carver's opening statement was considerably shorter and focused on a strategy of mitigation rather than innocence. "Mr. Hoffman has accepted responsibility for his actions," Carver said. "He has confessed. He has cooperated with law enforcement. He has expressed remorse. While nothing can undo the tragedy of what happened to Melissa Hartley, the court should consider Mr. Hoffman's mental health history and the fact that he has spent the last 23 years living with the guilt of what he did. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But it was all Carver had to work with. The prosecution's case took 3 days to present. They called Detective Marcus Liu to the stand first. Liu walked the jury through the entire investigation, from the original 2002 case to the 2024 reopening, explaining how DNA technology had evolved and how genetic genealogy had identified Hoffman as the suspect. The most powerful testimony came from the forensic experts. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the DNA analyst who had performed the 2024 reanalysis, explained in clear, accessible terms how she'd extracted a complete genetic profile from the blood sample. She showed charts and graphs demonstrating the match between that profile and Daniel Hoffman's DNA. Is there any doubt in your mind that the blood found on the windowsill in Melissa Hartley's bedroom came from Daniel Hoffman? Eddie Walsh asked. None whatsoever, Dr. Reeves replied. The probability of that blood belonging to anyone other than Daniel Hoffman is less than 1 in 8 trillion. That's greater than the entire population of Earth. The jury listened intently. Several members took notes. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was only the first day. On day 2, the prosecution played the video of Hoffman's confession. The courtroom went completely silent as Hoffman's voice filled the room, describing in his flat, emotionless tone how he'd planned the kidnapping, how he'd bypassed the security system, how he'd taken Melissa from her bed and carried her to his car. Jennifer Hartley broke down during this portion of the trial. She had to be escorted out of the courtroom by victim advocates, unable to listen to the man describe kidnapping her daughter. The jury watched her leave, and the impact was visible on their faces. This wasn't just evidence. This was a mother's pain, made real and immediate. The prosecution also called Margaret Foster, the neighbor who had seen the unfamiliar car with temporary plates. Now in her late 80s, Foster testified that she'd seen a dark sedan parked on the street around midnight on April 13, 2002. When shown photographs of Hoffman's 2002 Honda Accord, she confirmed it looked similar to what she remembered. Brian Wallace, the college student who'd been up late studying, testified next. He described seeing a man walking down the street around 1:30 a.m. When asked if he could identify that man, Wallace looked across the courtroom at Daniel Hoffman. I can't be 100% certain after all these years, he admitted. But the build is right. The height is right. It could have been him. The prosecution also presented evidence from Hoffman's home. Those newspaper clippings about Melissa's case, carefully preserved for 23 years. Dr. Lawrence Chun, a forensic psychologist, testified about what this behavior indicated. This is not uncommon in offenders who commit this type of crime, Dr. Chun explained. They keep souvenirs, mementos, news articles. It allows them to relive the experience. In Mr. Hoffman's case, his collection of articles about the investigation suggests he was monitoring what police knew, but also that he derived some satisfaction from revisiting what he'd done. The defense had almost nothing to work with. Carver called 2 witnesses, a psychiatrist who testified that Hoffman had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and a former coworker who said Hoffman had always seemed like a quiet, normal guy. It did nothing to counter the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented. On the 4th day, the prosecution presented their final witness, a forensic dive team member who testified about recovering remains from Lake Ray Hubbard. Acting on Hoffman's confession, the team had spent 3 days searching the area he'd described on the northeast shore of the lake. On the 3rd day, they'd found what they were looking for: bone fragments, a child's skull, remnants of clothing, and, heartbreakingly, a small plastic star-shaped barrette that Melissa had been wearing in her hair on the night she disappeared. The remains were in approximately 30 feet of water, the diver testified. They'd been there for a long time, weighted down with concrete blocks just like Mr. Hoffman described. We brought everything up carefully, documented the scene, and transported the remains to the medical examiner. Were you able to identify the remains? Eddie Walsh asked. Yes, through dental records and DNA comparison with a sample from Melissa's mother. The medical examiner confirmed the remains were those of Melissa Rose Hartley. There wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. This was no longer an abstract legal case. These were the physical remains of a 7-year-old girl who'd been stolen from her bed and thrown into a lake like garbage. The full horror of what Daniel Hoffman had done was laid bare. Ada Walsh's closing argument was brief and devastating. You've heard the evidence. You've heard the confession. You've seen the DNA match. You know that Daniel Hoffman kidnapped Melissa Hartley, caused her death, and disposed of her body in Lake Ray Hubbard. The only question before you is, will you hold him accountable? Will you deliver justice for Melissa, for her family, for this community? I believe you will. Richard Carver's closing was even shorter. My client has confessed. He's taken responsibility. I ask that you consider his cooperation and his remorse when deliberating. Judge Monroe gave the jury their instructions, and they retired to deliberate at 2:15 p.m. on March 7, 2025. The courtroom emptied, everyone scattering to wait. Jennifer Hartley remained in a private room with her advocates. Reporters camped out in the hallway. Detective Lou sat on a bench outside the courtroom, mentally exhausted, waiting to see if his work would result in justice. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 42 minutes. At 5:57 p.m., they sent word that they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom refilled quickly. Jennifer Hartley took her seat in the front row, clutching the hand of her victim advocate. David Hartley sat in his usual spot several rows back. Daniel Hoffman was led back to the defense table by bailiffs. Judge Monroe entered, and everyone stood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand you've reached a verdict, Judge Monroe said. The jury foreman, a retired teacher named Margaret Willis, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of capital murder, how do you find the defendant? We find the defendant, Daniel James Hoffman, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Not with cheers. This wasn't a moment for celebration, but with gasps, sobs, the sound of Jennifer Hartley breaking down completely, finally hearing the word she'd waited 23 years to hear. Guilty. He was guilty. Everyone knew it, everyone believed it, but hearing it made official by a jury of 12 citizens was different. It was justice beginning to be served. Judge Monroe gavelled for order. On the charge of aggravated kidnapping, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of evidence tampering, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, Your Honor. The jury has found the defendant guilty on all counts, Judge Monroe announced. We will proceed to the sentencing phase. This court is in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow. As bailiffs led Hoffman out of the courtroom, he looked back at Jennifer Hartley for the first time during the trial. She was staring at him with a mixture of rage and grief and something that might have been relief. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it and looked away. There were no words that could possibly matter now. The sentencing phase of the trial began the next morning. In Texas, capital murder carries only 2 possible sentences: life in prison without the possibility of parole or death. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty, arguing that Hoffman's crime was particularly heinous and that he'd shown no remorse beyond self-serving attempts to mitigate his punishment. The most powerful moment of the sentencing phase came when Jennifer Hartley took the stand to give her victim impact statement. She walked slowly to the witness box, looking frail and exhausted, aged beyond her years by decades of grief. I want to tell you about Melissa, she began, her voice shaking. She wasn't just a case file or a news story. She was my daughter. She was a real person with hopes and dreams and a future that was stolen from her. Melissa wanted to be an astronaut. She wanted to explore Mars. She had a telescope and she'd spend hours looking at the stars, and she'd tell me all about the constellations she'd learned. She was brilliant and curious and kind. She used to leave little notes around the house for me and her dad. Just little messages that said, I love you, with hearts drawn around the words. For 23 years, I've lived in a nightmare. I didn't know if my daughter was alive somewhere, suffering, waiting for me to find her, or if she was dead, and I'd never see her again. That not knowing was torture. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary day was torture because she wasn't there and I didn't know why. Now I know. Now I know that a man I'd let into my home, a man I trusted to fix our security system, used that trust to kidnap my baby. He took her from her bed while she slept. He kept her in a storage unit. He let her die. And then he threw her in a lake and went on living his life like nothing had happened. Do you know what that does to a person? Do you know what it's like to know that the person who destroyed your life, who murdered your child, was just out there somewhere, free, maybe even happy, while you were drowning in grief? It's unbearable. It's absolutely unbearable. I don't know if I believe in the death penalty as a concept. I've struggled with that question for years. But I know that Daniel Hoffman took my daughter's life, and he should not be allowed to keep his own. He doesn't deserve to breathe when Melissa can't. He doesn't deserve to see another sunrise when she's been in the dark for 23 years. I'm asking this court to impose the death penalty. For Melissa. For justice. For all the families of missing children who never get answers. There wasn't a person in the courtroom who wasn't crying. The jury looked devastated. Even Judge Monroe had to pause to collect herself before proceeding. The defense presented mitigation witnesses, Hoffman's sister, who testified that he'd had a difficult childhood with an abusive father, a psychologist who testified that Hoffman suffered from severe mental illness that impaired his judgment. But it rang hollow. Mental illness doesn't excuse kidnapping and murdering a child. A difficult childhood doesn't justify destroying another family. The jury deliberated on sentencing for 2 days. It was a longer deliberation than for the guilt phase, which suggested they were taking the decision seriously, weighing the gravity of imposing a death sentence. On March 10, 2025, at 3:20 p.m., they returned with their decision. We sentenced Daniel James Hoffman to death by lethal injection, the jury foreman announced. Daniel Hoffman showed no reaction. He sat motionless at the defense table, staring at nothing. Jennifer Hartley nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. Nothing could bring Melissa back. But it was justice. It was accountability. It was the closest thing to peace she would ever get. Judge Monroe formally imposed the sentence, setting an execution date pending the automatic appeals process that accompanies all death penalty cases in Texas. Hoffman was remanded to custody and would be transferred to death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. 23 years after Melissa Rose Hartley disappeared from her locked bedroom, the man responsible had been found, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The cold case was solved. Justice had been served. The Melissa Hartley case didn't end with Daniel Hoffman's conviction. In many ways, it was just beginning to make its full impact on law enforcement, forensic science, and the broader conversation about cold cases in America. The case became a textbook example of how genetic genealogy can solve seemingly impossible crimes. Law enforcement agencies from around the country contacted the Dallas Police Department, asking for details about their process, their protocol, their success. Detective Marcus Liu gave presentations at multiple conferences, sharing what he'd learned, encouraging other departments to revisit their own cold cases with fresh eyes and new technology. Within 6 months of Hoffman's conviction, the Texas Department of Public Safety announced a new cold case initiative, allocating $5 million in funding to reanalyze DNA evidence from unsolved cases dating back to the 1980s. The Hartley case had proven that no case was too old, no evidence too degraded, no crime too cold to potentially be solved. Other states followed suit. California expanded its cold case unit. Florida created a new genetic genealogy program. The FBI increased funding for its violent criminal apprehension program. The ripple effects of one solved case were enormous. The case also led to changes in how security system companies handle customer information and employee vetting. SecureTech Solutions, the company that employed Hoffman in 2002, implemented new background check procedures and restricted employee access to customer data. Industry-wide, there was a recognition that trusted professionals with access to homes needed to be monitored more carefully. Additionally, the case sparked discussions about the preservation of evidence in cold cases. The fact that a single drop of blood, carefully preserved for 23 years, was ultimately the key to solving the case emphasized the importance of proper evidence storage and the foresight to keep biological samples even when current technology can't analyze them effectively. We don't know what technology will be available in 10 or 20 years, Detective Liu said in one interview. But if we don't preserve the evidence now, we'll never have the chance to use those future technologies. The Hartley case proves that patience and preservation pay off. For Jennifer Hartley, the conviction brought a complicated kind of closure. She finally had answers, but the answers confirmed her worst fears. Melissa was gone, had been gone since 2002, and nothing would bring her back. In interviews after the trial, Jennifer spoke about the strange relief that came with knowing. The not knowing was its own kind of death, she said. Every day, I imagined 1,000 horrible possibilities. Now I know the truth, and while it's devastating, at least I'm not tortured by the unknown anymore. I can grieve properly. I can say goodbye properly. Jennifer became an advocate for families of missing children. She joined several organizations dedicated to supporting families and pushing for legislative changes. She spoke at conferences and did media interviews, using her experience to help others navigate their own nightmares. She also established the Melissa Rose Hartley Foundation, a nonprofit organization that raises money to fund DNA testing in cold cases and provides financial assistance to families searching for missing loved ones. The foundation's mission statement reads, "Every child deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves answers. Every case deserves another look." Within its first year, the foundation raised over $200,000 and funded DNA testing in 6 cold cases, 3 of which resulted in new leads and 1 of which resulted in an arrest. The Hartley case also resonated with the public in profound ways. It became a story of hope, proof that justice can prevail even after decades, that the truth will eventually come to light, that patient, determined investigators can solve the unsolvable. Countless families with their own missing loved ones reached out to Detective Lou, to Jennifer Hartley, to the Dallas Police Department, asking if genetic genealogy could help their cases too. Some of those families got answers. Others are still waiting. But the Hartley case gave them something invaluable: hope. There's a memorial bench in Pleasant Grove Park now, dedicated to Melissa Rose Hartley. It sits under a large oak tree with a clear view of the sky. A plaque on the bench reads, "Melissa Rose Hartley, October 12, 1994 to April 14, 2002. She dreamed of the stars. Now she's among them." People visit the bench regularly. Families bring their children and tell them about the little girl who wanted to be an astronaut. Students from Oakwood Elementary, Melissa's old school, visit on field trips and leave flowers. It's become a place of remembrance, but also a place of hope and community healing. The investigative techniques used in the Hartley case have now become standard protocol in cold case investigations across the country. Genetic genealogy is no longer a novel approach. It's a proven tool that has solved dozens of cases since the Hartley conviction. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Melissa Hartley case is the reminder it provides to anyone who has committed a crime and thinks they've gotten away with it. Science is advancing. Technology is improving. Evidence that couldn't be analyzed 20 years ago can be analyzed now. Evidence that can't be analyzed now might be analyzable in 10 years. There is no statute of limitations on justice. There is no expiration date on truth. And eventually, no matter how long it takes, the evidence will speak. The story of Melissa Rose Hartley is a tragedy. There's no way around that. A 7-year-old girl's life was stolen. A family was destroyed, and a community was traumatized. No amount of justice can undo what happened on that April night in 2002. But it's also a story about perseverance. About Detective Marcus Liu refusing to let a dusty old case file sit in storage when new technology offered a chance to solve it. About Jennifer Hartley refusing to give up hope even when hope seemed impossible. About a justice system that, despite its flaws and delays, eventually worked the way it's supposed to. Cold cases represent more than just unsolved crimes. Each one represents a family in pain, a community seeking closure, a victim who deserves justice. The Melissa Hartley case reminds us that these cases matter, that the people behind them matter, and that we as a society have a responsibility to keep searching for answers no matter how much time has passed. In the 3 years since this case was solved, dozens of other cold cases have been cracked using similar techniques. Families who'd given up hope have gotten answers. Communities that had forgotten old crimes have seen justice served. It's a trend that shows no signs of slowing down. If you're listening to this and you have information about an unsolved case, any case, no matter how old, please come forward. You might think your information isn't important, or that too much time has passed, or that no one will believe you. But that's not true. Every piece of information matters. Every tip, no matter how small, could be the one that breaks a case open. The Dallas Police Department's cold case unit can be reached through their website or by calling their tip line. If you're in a different city or state, look up your local cold case unit. They want to hear from you. They need to hear from you. The Hartley case also serves as a warning. If you've committed a crime and think you've gotten away with it, think again. DNA evidence doesn't disappear. Witnesses' memories might fade, but biological evidence is forever. And with genetic genealogy, even if you've never been arrested, even if your DNA is not in any law enforcement database, you can still be found through your relatives' publicly shared genetic information. There is nowhere to hide. Not anymore. The technology exists. The will exists. And justice, though sometimes slow, is inevitable. For Jennifer Hartley, life goes on, though it will never be the same. She still lives in Dallas, still runs the foundation in her daughter's name, still speaks out for families of missing children. She's found purpose in her pain, turning her tragedy into a mission to help others. Melissa wanted to make a difference in the world, Jennifer said in a recent interview. She wanted to explore new frontiers and discover new things. Through the foundation, through the changes that came from solving her case, she's still making a difference. That brings me comfort. It means her life, though far too short, still matters. It means she's still here in some way. That's ultimately what this story is about. It's about remembering. It's about refusing to let victims become just case numbers in a filing cabinet. It's about keeping their memory alive, keeping the search for truth alive, and keeping faith that justice will eventually prevail. Melissa Rose Hartley wanted to explore the stars. She wanted to discover new worlds. She wanted to make the impossible possible. In a way, through the solving of her case, she did. She proved that no case is impossible, no crime too perfect, no passage of time too long to prevent the truth from emerging. 23 years. That's how long it took. But justice came. It always does, eventually, if we're patient enough and determined enough and we never give up. This has been the story of the Dallas 2002 cold case solved, the disappearance and murder of Melissa Rose Hartley, and the arrest that shocked the community. It's a reminder that every cold case represents a family still waiting, a truth still hidden, and hope that must never die. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering Melissa. And if you know something about an unsolved case, please speak up. Your voice could be the one that brings someone home. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always watching, always waiting, and always inevitable. Remember Melissa Rose Hartley. Remember that cold cases can be solved. Remember that truth always finds a way.